To the Thursday, October 11th, 2012 Planning and Zoning meeting. We're going to begin this evening by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Jens, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Item number 2 on our agenda this evening is the approval of the minutes from September 27th, 2012. Do I have a motion to approve?
Make a motion to approve.
That's Todd. Do I have a second?
I second.
That's Mr. Redenauer. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Item number 3 is an item that's not on consent this evening. It's a request for an administrative permit approval to construct a 106-foot monopole communication tower at 5100 42nd Place. You guys ready? Do we have to swear people in for this? I'm sorry. Okay. Anybody who is going to speak on this matter tonight, please stand and be sworn in for your testimony.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. So you guys ready to begin with your presentation?
Yes. Thank you, Chairman Zimmerman. John McCoy with the planning staff. And this is a request for administrative permit use approval. It's a conditional use in the zoning code. And really the scope of the development is not large in scale as far as area extent, but it is a use as a conditional use that requires review by the Planning and Zoning Commission by nature of the use, which is a monopole communications tower. It's basically located 800 feet north of 41st Street and 600 feet west of 49th Avenue on Lot 7 of the Indian River Industrial Center subdivision. And the proposal is for a 106-foot tall monopole communication tower on a 70 by 70 lease area on Lot 7 and to provide for up to 3 users on that pole. The site's located, as I said, north of 41st Street, and it's outlined in red. The purple area you see, the darker purple area, is IG, General Industrial Zoning. The lighter purple you see is Light Industrial Zoning. The brown area you see to the east of the subject site is RMH8, which is Residential Mobile Home, 8 units per acre. And that is a residential area that's kind of an enclave within that overall industrial zoning. One of the other things on this slide I'd like to point out to you is there's this star indicates a site that was earlier considered for the tower. It didn't meet the land development criteria, and the site was shifted. They had a fairly small search ring. The site was shifted to the subject site that we're considering now. Next slide is more of a detailed location of the aerial. And again, Lot 7 outlined in red. The lease area is approximately outlined in yellow. Lot 7 of the industrial park. To the east of it's a vacant lot. To the east of it is a developed industrial lot. And to the east is the residential area. These are all lots within the industrial subdivision. This is an industrial development that has been built over through the years, and vacant industrial property to the west, retention area, and then more industrial property again to the north of the subject site. I would like to show you some photo simulations of what the tower will look like when it's constructed, what it's projected to look like. And the views I've selected are from this location at 49th Street and 41st Street, from almost due south of the tower site on 41st Street, and then the other one's off the aerial, it's on 45th Street. So with that, I'd like to show you those photo simulations. And again, this is from right out at 41st Street, looking a little bit northwest to where the tower location, and again, this is what the projected photo simulation would have the tower look like from that vantage point. From due south, actually on the south side of 41st Street, looking back through that industrial development I pointed out, you can see the tower coming over the trees from that vantage point. And then from the north, looking down a long driveway just off the south side of 45th Street, you can see again the tower in the distance. what it looks like. This is a site plan for the tower facility. It's this square that is the actual proposed development. And you can see area-wise, it's actually a little bit smaller than the cul-de-sac within the subdivision. So it's 70 by 70. It's fairly small in aerial extent. It's the actual tower use that's the reason for the conditional use that we're here tonight. The next slide is actually a detail of the site plan. It shows the landscaping on the outside of the fence, concrete driveway, fence to secure the site. This is ground-mounted equipment for the carriers and their antennas, and future sites for ground-mounted equipment, and the tower and antenna itself. This is a elevation, or what it looks like from cross-section. Again, at the landscape, at the ground view, the fence, the equipment, the tower itself, and then the antenna on the tower. As far as related items go, this does meet all the specific land use criteria in Chapter 971, and the applicant has obtained an FAA permit, which is required. Again, this is in proximity to the airport. That's been evaluated by the FAA, and that's their purview. They have obtained that FAA permit. And with that, I would like to get to the recommendation. Staff does recommend that the Planning and Zoning Commission grant administrative permit use approval for the monopole tower and authorize the chairman to sign the approval order. Thank you.
Should I ask the fellow commissioners if they had any ex parte communication regarding this matter?
Just briefly, I think would do the trick.
If anyone has had any ex parte communication with anyone regarding this matter, please speak now. Okay, no. Is there anyone from the audience who would like to testify on this issue tonight? Nobody?
I move approval as presented by staff.
Second.
Did you get those?
Motion by Hamner, second by Tripson.
Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Okay, thank you. That was item number 3. Item number 4 is a public hearing. It is the consideration of proposed land development regulation amendments to Chapter 901 definitions and 930 stormwater management and flood protection relating to flood protection for consistency with the 2010 Florida Building Code.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Roland DeBlois, Chief of County Environmental Planning and Code Enforcement. I'll be presenting this item. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. This is a proposed land development regulation amendment for flood protection regulations to bring our regulations into consistency with the 2010 Florida Building Code. Just a little background. Back in 1968, Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program by adopting the National Flood Insurance Act. In 1973, Congress adopted the Flood Disaster Protection Act, mandating that all buildings located in flood hazard areas have flood insurance coverage as a condition of federal aid or loans from federally insured banks. In 1978, Indian River County became a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program. That was the year that the FEMA produced the flood insurance rate maps, and we entered the program at that time. And since that time, the county's regulated construction in flood zones for compliance with the flood insurance program. The Florida Building Code is a unified state building code used by local governments throughout Florida for regulating building construction. Until recently, flood protection regulations for construction design were not included in the Florida Building Code, so any participant in the National Flood Insurance Programs in Indian River County, we had our regulations elsewhere, in our case, in our land development regulations. The 2010 edition, different from past editions, however, does include flood-resistant design of buildings, and therefore Indian River County, as well as all other local governments in the state, are in the process of revising their flood protection regulations to be consistent with the new building code requirements. As part of this process, the state, through the Department of Emergency Management and working with the Florida Building Commission, they produced a model flood ordinance for use by local governments. And essentially it was designed for local governments to either adopt it as it was drafted or to use it as a guideline. Now, in our case, we're using it as a guideline because our particular flood regulations are kind of lumped in our chapter that also does general stormwater management. So we've pulled in the appropriate sections and drafted an ordinance that you're reviewing tonight. There's three main parts to the proposed ordinance revisions. The first part relates to revising our definitions chapter in our land development regulations to create and revise certain definitions. These are definitions that are essentially reflecting what's in the Florida Building Code or are definitions we've had through FEMA's flood insurance program for compliance with that program. The other part, second part, is actually amending our Chapter 930, Stormwater Management and Flood Protection, which is the main code in our LDRs that regulates development in flood hazard areas. And finally, the third main part is under our Building Codes chapter. We're adopting local administrative and technical amendments to the Florida Building Code, and that's primarily to account for certain higher standards that the county has that will now be reflected to be consistent with the code, and I'll explain that a little more later. Now, focusing on Chapter 930, which is really the main area of revisions. As I explained, it contains both stormwater management and flood protection. These revisions are really focusing on the flood protection components. And in our code right now under 930, there's one section in particular, 930.072, that has the flood protection requirements. I just want to emphasize that most of these revisions are essentially a rewording, reformatting of existing requirements that we already have, and they're also already adopted in the Florida Building Code effective March 15th, 2012. So this is mostly a rewording, reformatting of requirements that we've already had or have been adopted. Under the flood protection requirements, under the proposed ordinance, it breaks it down into a number of headings as to the application of flood protection requirements. I'll just list them here: site plans, buildings, subdivisions, site improvements, manufactured homes, recreational vehicles, parks, tanks. There's a category for other development, and then additional requirements, for example, like cut and fill requirements that the county already has. The other thing that's, again, this is already required through FEMA program, but it's now going to be reflected more specifically in our ordinances. There are actually some structures that are exempt from needing building permits that are required to be reviewed for compliance under the flood insurance program. And those include like railroads, non-residential farm buildings, temporary construction sheds, temporary modular offices, and even chickee huts in some cases. These are, and under the code, what will happen if these come to our attention under our review of projects, they will be subject to a county flood protection permit, what we call type B or C permits, even though that they're exempt from needing a building permit. As far as the amendments to the Florida Building Code, there's a process for local amendments, and that would be through our Chapter 401. And as I explained briefly earlier, the county does have certain higher standards than the minimum required through either the Building Code or the National Flood Program. And some of the benefits of that, and we've had these in place for a number of years, is that the county gets certain points or credits under what's called the community rating system of the flood insurance program, and as a result, of these extra initiatives, flood insurance premiums throughout the county are discounted than what they would be if we didn't take these extra initiatives. And in Indian River County, we have a rating of what's called a Class 6, which results in 20% discount to most flood insurance premiums as a result of those extra benefits. And to reflect those higher standards, there's a procedure to amend the Florida Building Code. Just to give you an example, we have what's called a freeboard, a 1/2 a foot of freeboard. What that is an additional amount of height above the base flood elevation on the flood maps. It uses a factor of safety in determining the level of the structure's lower floor or flood proofing. That's one of our main higher standards. We also have another one, for example, that under substantial improvement and calculation of costs for 50% improvement, we've established a cumulative time period of 10 years for determining those costs, which is not automatically contemplated by the federal program, and that just helps define the improvements. The other thing I want to point out, and this is important, you all are probably aware, we've had workshops in the past year or two that FEMA is in the process of revising the flood insurance rate maps. It's under what they call a map modernization process. And they've been doing that, working with county staff and various agencies locally for the past couple of years. The process entailed assessment of current available flood studies and also using, high-resolution aerials for the flood maps to be more accurate in using and depicting the flood zones. We've through the county, we're talking, I guess it's referred to as LiDAR aerials, where they have better information on elevations. I just to show the difference between the old maps, which were pretty general. It was a challenge to locate, in some cases, with accuracy, the boundaries of the flood zones. General map. The new maps are digitized. They're made to be, can be overlaid on aerials. And here's an example. This is the moorings on South Barry Island. You can see that with the level of detail from the newer maps, what this is showing actually is more properties that are dropping out or are no longer in what's considered a flood zone because of better information on elevations. Now, the new flood maps are set to be effective on December 4th. Actually, to be part of the program and through the process we've taken, the county's obligated to take action on these maps on or before December 4th. That's when they're set to become effective. And under the proposed ordinance, there's a section that specifically adopts these new maps by reference. Another important thing, and I think we've brought this up in the past, actually with a revision we did back in July, the new maps changed the vertical datum on which the maps are based from the older National Geodetic vertical datum of 1929, revising it to the North American vertical datum of 88. And this is really the premise for the updates that the county's doing throughout its requirements for the type of datum. So that's an important aspect of it. Since we drafted the ordinance and wrote the staff report this past week, we did get comments from the Department of Emergency Management. As part of the process, DEM is reviewing all local floodplain ordinances that are proposed for revision to ensure consistency with the building code. We did get some comments from the state consultants who are reviewing the plans for the state this past week. And essentially, they concurred that the ordinance as proposed essentially does what's intended to bring it consistent with the Florida Building Code. It did have some minor technical non-substantive recommendations just to clear up some consistencies, but overall, there were minor recommendations for revisions. In summary, the proposed ordinance is based on the state model floodplain ordinance developed by Department of Emergency Management and the Florida Building Commission. It revises the county's regulations to be consistent with the 2010 Florida Building Code. It amends the building code to account for some higher standards that the county has as part of the process. And finally, as part of it, it adopts the new flood maps by reference. Staff's recommendation is that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend that the Board of County Commissioners adopt the proposed maps, proposed ordinance, allowing further non-substantive revisions based on state review comments. That's our recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, so this is a public hearing. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak on this matter this evening?
Can I ask staff a question first, please, sir?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Can you explain to me, I'm confused in zone AO, the design flood elevation. We're talking about a percentage of wave height, and I don't remember us ever having something like in this new wording. It's on page 3 of the attachment. It looks like a definition.
Actually, I didn't introduce David Hayes, who's a land development manager with the County Engineering Division, is here. He is, we consider the expert on questions such as you have, so we'll defer.
I just was
David.
remembering on the corner of 58th and 60, when Home Depot was developed, we found out we went down and up. There was a little, this is why I'm confused, because we had to match heights.
No, that's cut and fill. That's different from the AL.
Oh, well,
For the
I only majored in graduation, so I understand, but this confused me.
For the record, David Hayes, Indian River County Engineering Land Development Manager. AO refers to a flood depth that's above the highest existing grade. And basically throughout the county, any place I'm sorry, I thought it was on. Anywhere in the county that we have an AO designation, off the top of my head, I can't recall any place that it's deeper than 1 foot. So that would mean a flood elevation of 1 foot above the highest existing grade. And I believe throughout the county, you will only find that up and down the shoreline near the VE zone. In the case that you mentioned for State Road 60 at 58th Avenue, that's AE.
This is more coastal than it would be in a
Correct.
Coastal. Okay.
Yes, sir. The AE
Hence
zone, which is referring to out at 50 and 58th and 60, is a base flood elevation in a designated elevation.
Okay. Thank you. One other quick question. Was there any provisioning, or do we have anything for, like, if in areas, is there any such thing in the new law, about grandfathering, where areas are covered or grandfathered in, or we have to, how do we deal with that? Or do we?
There's a couple of different avenues as far as grandfathering. Specifically when you talk about grandfathering, typically you're referring to a structure that was pre-firm or prior to 1978.
Right.
So it's basically allowed to maintain its own structure without having to bring it up to standards. Until such time they do any additions or alterations to it, then it may fall into some other rules. But anything prior to 1978 that was constructed or permitted and built, then it's what we call grandfathered.
And David, those are called pre-firm.
Okay.
And you can make a lateral addition to a pre-firm structure and not have to meet the new base flood elevations. It can be at the same.
If you try and go up, then you have the problem?
Well, no, sir, not necessarily. But if what Bob was referring to is you can actually do a lateral addition to a pre-firm structure that may be below base flood elevation, and you can build it with the floor of the addition at the existing floor's elevation. You do not have to provide a step up and come in. Yes, sir.
Gotcha.
Actually, correct me if I'm wrong, there's besides just pre-firm, if there was we're revising the firm maps, and if all of a sudden someone's house was built on a firm map to the existing correct elevation, to meet the code. If they now are below what the firm map would show, they are also grandfathered into the old rate. They wouldn't be penalized with the new, you know, they wouldn't say, oh, well, now you're below, even though you were, when you built it in 1985, you were fine. That's another form of grandfathering. It's not pre-firm, correct? It's just
Correct.
pre-update.
You are basically grandfathered at whatever map addition that you built under originally. We've had, this is effectively the third one. We had 78,
Right.
89, and we had a couple specific maps that were revised in like 92, and then now the 2012 maps. So there's been a couple of renditions along the way, but they've only been specific cases or specific areas. So effectively, whatever you were built under, your structure still remains meeting those rules for that.
Just for
for
interest's
that
sake, on
elevation.
balance, are the more accurate firm maps, do they tend to place more property in the flood zone or take more property out of the flood zone? The more accurate ones.
Yeah, let me just say, we didn't do it was hard to do a full-scale detailed analysis of that, but generally what we've seen is we've seen properties come out of the flood zone in particular cases. And the example I gave was the moorings, for example. And we have seen that in some places. But on the other hand, a lot of them are pretty much as they were, too.
Yeah.
So that's kind of anecdotal.
Thank you.
I've got another question on the definitions on page 6. What does the definition of a light-duty truck have to do with the floodplain?
You know, it took me a while to figure that out, but what I did find out was it kind of cross-references another definition, and that had to do with park trailers, and part of that definition relates, it references if the trailer is designed to be pulled by a light truck, and then it goes back to this definition. So it's not something you would expect
It's
to
not
see.
something that floats, Gen Z.
I have a question. So on flood zone C, X, there is no application in effect, correct? Like a preferred flood zone?
If you are in an X zone, then basically you just meet whatever the local criteria is. You don't have to meet any FEMA regulations as far as flood elevations.
I just, as an insurance person, I find that interesting because 30% of the claims are in flood zone X. I know with Katrina, the city of New Orleans was actually in a flood zone X. So I think there's some issues with how they formulate that. And
Well,
Are you comparing us to Katrina? Or-
no, I
Orleans?
think people have this false sense of security when they're told that they're not in a flood zone, and in reality, they are in a flood zone. The entire state of Florida, the peninsula, is a real flood zone, and we do have claims in flood zone B.
by true definition, you're correct. The entire state of Florida is in a flood zone. It's just depending on what type of flood zone. And the X is, you have two different types of X. You have 100-year
And the 250.
elevation or 1% chance of a flood occurring, which is basically the cutoff. And then
Sure.
you have a 0.2% chance of a flood occurring, which is the higher elevations.
Sure. I just get a lot of comments about people in their properties not being in a flood zone, and that actually is not accurate, so just a point of note.
So should we open the public hearing? Does anybody have a comment? Anyone want to say anything?
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Roland, just a couple of questions. On page 5, there is a new definition for the floodplain administrator. Who is going to be our floodplain administrator?
We're proposing not to change it. Right now, it is the Community Development Director, and that's how it would continue to be under what it is.
So later on, when in the amendments to 400, when the building official has to confer with the floodplain manager, that will be a supervisor subordinate situation.
On the speakerphone.
Is that what was contemplated, or was it contemplated that an engineering type person would be the floodplain manager and the building official would be the building director? Or if you know?
No, the way it is in our current ordinance, the community development director is the floodplain manager, and that's because we've got a lot of technical and non-technical responsibilities under this. Roland works for me, the building official works for me, and between the two, we have to do a lot of things. Roland does all the community rating system work and manages all that, maintains elevation certificates, all those things. Jose, as the building director now, and who implements the building code, is on the front line and responsible for actually implementing building code activities. We all defer to David and Cindy, who works with them. They're both certified floodplain managers, and they're technical experts that we depend on. We get input from them, but there are a number of irons in this fire. So, I mean, it's not a straight linear activity. There are a lot of branches to this.
So if there would be a question from an applicant that would come in, who would that be directed to? Which entity?
It depends what the question is.
Okay.
Hopefully somebody has an answer. I mean, we are talking about the government.
But basically, the technical questions are David's purview, and we rely on him. And David reviews building permit applications for technical floodplain aspects of that. So he is advising Jose, he's advising me, he's advising Roland. We look to David and the engineering staff for the technical information. But I can tell you, we coordinate on a lot of things. We coordinate. Another thing is, we're responsible, Roland is in charge of code enforcement, and we're responsible for actually enforcing the code when we have people that violate the code. And we've been dealing with that. Actually, some of the times it's insurance agents that maybe bring to FEMA or the National Flood Insurance Program, bring to their attention that someone finished off a floor of a house that's below in a VE zone, and it's not supposed to be finished off, and we have the responsibility of taking enforcement action. And if we don't do it, we're subject to termination from the program. So, as I said, there are a lot of different components to this, and that's why we structured it the way it is.
Do property owners have the ability to contest flood zone determinations?
Let me just say, they do have an opportunity for letters of map revision, which is not that uncommon. We've had whole subdivisions, particularly some of the newer ones, apply for that, and there's actually some that have gotten it. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's some that on the map, if you look at the map itself, it looks like a subdivision may be in a flood zone, but if you cross-reference them, we also keep track of letters of map revision, keep track of those, and some are in fact out of the flood zone per that map revision. They just don't show it on the map per se.
And also through this map modernization process that we've been going through, there was an entire appeal mechanism that people had the opportunity to do.
And also I have a question. Page number 13, number 7, interpretations. In the interpretation and application of these floodplain regulations, all provisions shall be, and then when you get to number 2, liberally construed in the favor of the governing body. Was that something that the state mandated or the federal government mandated be in this policy, or is this something that gave birth at the staff level?
Now, essentially, what you see that's underlined on that page came from the state model ordinance for consistency with the building code.
I can tell you that most of the time, the case law says that an ordinance is presumed constitutional or correct. Now, I have never run into any language that describes something that should be liberally construed in favor of a governing body. That's an interesting twist.
It goes without saying, I
Well,
think.
I suppose, but here they've really said it. It's right there. They finally admit it.
But by approving it, you absolutely agree with it. That's the problem I have.
It would seem that the burden, it might be better to say that the burden is on the appellant or the property owner to show that the flood designation is incorrect or erroneous.
Now, is that something we can modify and still stay consistent?
And two good questions that Mr. Brugnano has taken from me because I haven't gotten that far, but good.
I think it's something we could look at with our attorneys, and again, we're using the model ordinance as a guideline. I think there's certain flexibilities as long as it's not deemed inconsistent with the intent. I think this might fall into that category, so we'll get with the attorneys to look at that.
Thank you.
Roland and Bob, a couple other questions. Page 7, market value. Two-thirds of the way down, market value may be established by a qualified independent appraiser. Actual cash value, replacement cost depreciated for age and quality of construction, or tax assessment value adjusted to approximate market value by a factor provided by the property appraiser. Is there a punctuation discrepancy in there? I mean, I understand that market value may be established by an independent contractor. Is that a period or a comma, or should there be an or cash value can be established by the tax assessment value adjusted to approximate market value? I didn't quite understand what was going on there.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I think when I read it, I interpreted that the independent appraiser was going to use this method of actual cash value, the replacement cost depreciated for age and quality of construction.
I mean,
We can,
It's a meaningful question because this gets down to the question of if your house is damaged, can you build it back or not? And it depends on whether it's 50% of the value. So it'd probably be good to clarify that because that could be contested for sure.
We've had to deal with market value several times and have some experience doing it, but
That should be liberally construed in favor of the homeowner. Strictly liberally construed in favor of the homeowner.
May not want to change your definition.
we can, again, Roland, this came from the model ordinance.
Yeah, we can. We can
Effectively, if I can just kind of ad lib in here a little bit, it does, this definition does come from the model ordinance, but it's actually the practice we've been using. We start out with the property appraiser's assessed value on a structure when we look at determining whether it's going to need to be applied as a less than substantial or substantial improvement structure. The homeowner always has the ability to come in with an appraisal. We just had one a couple of days ago. It came in and the appraised value was considerably higher than the assessed value, and it had the depreciation for the age of the structure off of it. We looked at it, we took it to the real estate agent that works in our office. She looked at it, she confirmed with it, and we checked with the building department. They didn't see any inconsistencies with it, and we allowed it to be used as the value of the home in order for them to add to and improve the home, which actually put it into a less than substantial structure. Yeah. So we basically have always been following this. It may have not just been spelled out in this terminology as a definition in the codes itself. But that's FEMA's rules, and that's always been FEMA's rules. I shouldn't say always, but it has been for about 20 years.
Yeah. So there is a process that's described. Is it just a practice that's kind of just been adopted, or is there actually a process by which a homeowner can go in and say, I contest, the valuation you've put on what's remaining in my structure, and I want to bring in my independent appraiser, and there's a method that's spelled out in this document on how to do that or elsewhere?
Correct. It's
Okay,
actually
great.
spelled out in a FEMA technical bulletin is where it actually comes from. And this definition just pulls the language out of that.
That's perfect.
So it's the practice that we've always been using. And like I said, if a contractor comes in for an improvement on a home in a flood zone, and there seems to be some question as to whether it needs to be applied as a less than substantial or more than substantial, we always call them. And we let them know if they are coming in and it's going to be more than substantial and there's going to be any problems with it, we always call the contractor and talk to them and let them know that up front. And they have the opportunity, like I said, and some of them have come in with appraisals that have been higher and been able to apply that.
I understand. Makes sense.
So that's construed towards the homeowner.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Staying along that same line, page 9, top of the page, substantial damage. I'm worried about the timeline. We've got, the 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. I guess my question would be when? Or should it be at the time the damage occurred? Further on down in substantial improvement, we're introduced into the 6-month category, or 6-month time frame. What do you know what was meant by substantial damage as far as the change, or as far as the time period when the damage occurred?
Again, I don't think, I think part of the issue was it's not been defined and we're defining it. And
Okay.
we came up with 6 months as a reasonable time period, not only for that, but particularly for appraisals. If someone's putting an appraisal on a value pre or post damage, it has to be a value that's within the time frame, a reasonable time frame.
All right. The Commissioner Solari question. How much is this going to cost the price, or affect the price of an average 3-bedroom, 2-bath house? At all? More fill, less fill?
No, essentially, as Roland said, this is a reformatting, rewording. This shouldn't have any effect, any cost effect.
Okay.
It's mandatory. There's very little of this that's discretionary. This is
Right.
mandatory.
Right,
And it's already being done.
right.
So will this possibly affect insurance premiums?
No, I think that's rezoning issues
Okay.
could in fact affect
It would,
insurance.
it would
premiums.
affect insurance rates if we didn't adopt it, because then we wouldn't get a preferred rate under the NFIP, and people would be punished in that regard, so
Very true.
we're doing it, I think. Any further discussion? Are we ready for a vote? Do we have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve staff's recommendations.
Brad Emmons made the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
That's Todd. Any further discussion?
We're going to work on that one line, though, right?
Right, correct.
About liberal.
We're gonna strike that.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes. Commissioners' matters, are there any?
Bill at a Tea Party meeting with that line.
Seeing as how there are none, item number 6, planning matters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Stan Bowling, Planning Director. Just a couple of items. Since your last meeting, the Board of County Commissioners, consistent with your recommendation, approved the request from Grace Lutheran to change their condition to allow up to 66 children at their daycare. The other thing I wanted to mention is the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting is coming up. The next meeting is scheduled in 2 weeks on October 25th, and there will be items for that meeting. In November and December, we have, just because of the holidays, just one scheduled meeting each of those months, the second Thursday in November, the second Thursday in December. We believe we will have at least one item for the November 8th P&Z meeting. So the next 2 meetings, October 25th and November 8th, you should plan on there being meetings. At this point in time, it looks like we may not need a meeting in December, but we'll know more probably by our next meeting. And that's all that I had.
Any attorneys' matters?
No, sir.
We're adjourned.